Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So today I'm going to be talking to you about macroeconomics, which looks at the economy as a whole, rather than microeconomics, which looks at individuals and firms. So we're going to start with 4 economic indicators, which can give us an idea of how healthy an economy actually is. So we'll start with the first one, which is GDP growth, gross domestic product growth. So the GDP is the total output of those individuals and firms. And what we get is this budget cycle. So this is shown here by a growth trend line, which is 2%. This is the typical rate of growth that an economy will grow at. And what we get is the real GDP fluctuating around this trend line. So this gives us boosts and recessions. And typically in a boost, we'll see a higher level of inflation and lower unemployment. And typically in a recession, we'll see a lower level of inflation and higher unemployment. And I'll explain these later on. So the next indicator is inflation. So what does inflation tell us? It tells us the rate at which prices are growing. So typically we'll see in a boom, the prices are growing, so inflation is rising. Why do we see this? Because consumers are willing to spend more. They're willing to use their wages to go out and buy more goods. So what does this mean? It means that there's a higher demand for goods, and therefore firms can raise their prices to take advantage of this higher demand. Whereas in a recession, we typically see prices falling, which means inflation is falling. And this is because consumers are now putting their money in their pockets, which means that prices are falling because demand is falling. So this brings me on to the next economic indicator, the unemployment rate. And this is the total number of people actively seeking employment but can't get it, divided by the total people looking for employment. So what we typically get is a higher level of unemployment during a recession because firms are laying off workers due to reduced demand from consumers because they're not willing to spend their disposable income. Whereas in a boom, we see a lower rate of unemployment because firms are looking to hire people because the consumer demand is higher because people are willing to spend their disposable income. So that is typically what we see with unemployment. And we've seen this with the US. The US recently, this month, said that reported that their unemployment rate was at 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years. So this would, in theory, mean that the US is in a boom. However, some of the other economic indicators, like their inflation rate, which is below 2%, indicates that this may not be the case. So sometimes you can get it doesn't always tell us the whole picture. You need a few indicators. And then finally, the last indicator is the current account. So what does the current account tell us? It is the balance of payments. So it's telling us whether an economy is a net exporter or a net importer. So typically we see countries like China, Vietnam, those Indonesian countries kind of being net exporters because of the cheaper labour. And we see like countries like the UK, for example, which are net importers. So this would be shown by a current account deficit, whereas China has a current account surplus. So when you really need to worry about the current account is when the deficit is significant and persistent, because there are underlying fundamental issues with the economy. So the government needs to intervene and boost the exports in that country. So I hope this gives you an idea of what the economic indicators tell us, and a good way to find out the exact reports of these is the FX Street. So the FX Street has an economic calendar which tells us the macroeconomic indicators at the time they come out, and this should be used in influencing your investment decisions.